Chapter 24 Lindbergh Reports A Man on His Island. It was the first day of summer, June 21st, 1938, when the Lindberghs arrived in Iliak. From the moment he set foot on his tiny island, Charles loved everything about it. The salty smell of the sea, the steeply slanted beach of storm-ground stones, the way the tide receded so far out that twice a day he could walk on the exposed sea bottom. He knew that buying the French island had been foolhardy, understanding only too well that conditions in France are bad. The country was in economic and political chaos, and war clouds loomed. The island's main attraction, however, was its proximity to Dr. Carroll. That summer, over breakfasts of black bread and oatmeal, during walks along the wave-pounded shore, in the flickering shadows cast by Carol's fireplace, the two talked about the precarious state of civilization and race betterment. Both men blamed England and France's degeneration on democracy. It was time, they agreed, for the construction of civilized men who would rebuild a world suited to their needs. The start of a new social order organized according to biological worth. Despite having built a primitive lab in the courtyard of Carol's house on St. Gildas, Charles did little serious work on his perfusion pumps and mechanical kidney. He hadn't lost confidence in the projects, but the problems of civilization and survival towered above all else, he later explained. Why spend time on biological experiments when our very civilization was at stake, when one of history's greatest cataclysms impended? On August 2nd, a cable arrived on Iliak from Colonel Raymond Lee, an American military attaché in London. He urged Charles to fly to the Soviet Union and inspect their air force. Eager to see enough of Europe to be able to think intelligently about the problems which exist here, Charles agreed. It was a bad time to leave the island. The plasterers and painters hired to patch up the long-neglected house had only just finished, and while they'd made the place safe to live in, it remained antiquated. The only light came from kerosene lanterns, and the water had to be drawn from a well. Unable to produce edible meals on the wood-burning stove, their English cook had quit and returned to Kent. So had the nursemaid, who couldn't abide the isolation or the outhouse. And then there were the children. Charles had no qualms about leaving John with the local help Anne had quickly hired. The boy had taken to the island almost immediately, fishing on the beach with a net and collecting pocketfuls of stones. But 15-month-old Land was a different story. He cried often, not just because he was teething, but also because the chaotic new household left him feeling anxious. Charles, however, never considered going without Anne, and although she dreaded the trip, she never considered staying behind. I must go, she told herself. I must be part of Charles's life. For weeks they toured Kiev, Odessa, Rostov, and Moscow. The Soviets were not as eager to show off their air force as the Germans had been, allowing Charles access to just a handful of aviation sites. The Communists padded the Lindbergh schedule with visits to museums, a ballet, a new subway, a collective farm, and even an ice cream factory. Charles concluded the Soviets had nothing worth showing. Even their best airplanes were pitiful, as were their research facilities and their pilot training schools. In no way would Soviet military aviation be a match for the Luftwaffe. He spoke even less admiringly of Russian life, with its secret trials and executions, its lines in front of stores, and the scarceness of goods, its control of information and suppression of free speech, even as he lauded Hitler's Nazism. He declared the communist system unworkable. It is likely that Charles's utter distaste for the Soviet Union stemmed from his belief in eugenics, which placed Russians in the non-white category. The infusion of Mongol blood, eugenicists believed, had resulted in the Russians' racial characteristics being more Asian than European. Whenever Charles spoke of the yellow race, which he definitely thought was inferior, he was including the Russians. Asia presses towards us on the Russian border, he warned a year later. We must build our white ramparts and guard our heritage from the Mongol and Persian and more. September 1938. The boys were already tucked in for the night when Charles and Anne returned to Iliak on September 10th. Eager to see their children after being gone for a month, the parents poked their heads into the boys' bedroom. A grinning John quickly sat up in the dark. He showed them his new flashlight and his toy boat. Land woke too, standing up in his crib and crying until Anne played patty cake with him. Charles tried to relax back into his island routine, but he took little pleasure in his early morning swims or his long talks with Carol. Over all of it hung the threat of war. 8 days later, despite the sudden drop in temperature and the lashing rain, Charles and Anne took their motorboat to the fishing village of Bugueles, where they'd garaged their car. The news coming from Eastern Europe wasn't good. The Czechs had ordered the mobilization of troops to the border, and the French were drawing up plans for an attack on Germany. War could erupt at any moment. After climbing into the front seat of the car, Charles turned the radio dials, searching for the latest news. Dripping wet, their breath fogging the windows, they strained to hear the crackling voices from London. There is still hope, one British minister assured radio listeners. Nothing is desperate, said another. But it sounded desperate to the Lindberghs. Discouraged, they boated back to Iliac and the train. 2 days later, a cable arrived from America's ambassador to England, Joseph Kennedy. Would Charles come to London immediately? Kennedy wanted the flyer to write a report about military aviation in Europe. Charles's comments, Ambassador Kennedy promised, would be wired to government officials in both Washington, D.C. and London. The Lindberghs hurried to their bedroom to pack. John followed. They told him about going to London. But not for long, only for a day or two, said Anne. We'll be back the end of the week. When will that be? Asked John, who'd recently celebrated his 6th birthday without them. Then, after plopping onto the floor, he played with his seashell collection and stayed underfoot until his parents left. Without doubt, the German air fleet is now stronger than that of any other country in the world. Charles's report for Ambassador Kennedy began. Her air strength is greater than that of all European countries combined. He believed Germany had the means of destroying London, Paris, and Prague if he wishes to do so, and England and France together could do nothing about it because they did not have enough planes for either defense either defense or a counterattack. It was, he continued, essential to avoid war in the near future at any cost or risk the loss of European civilization. It was a devastating report. The world's foremost aviation expert was saying Germany could wipe Britain and France off the face of the earth. The Lindbergh report, as it came to be called, quickly circulated. In France, it stunned Prime Minister Edouard Daladier. Peace must be preserved, he was overheard to say, or French cities would be destroyed with no means of defense. In England, Prime Minister Chamberlain was handed a copy of the report as he boarded the plane that would take him to Bad Godesberg, Germany, for a round of delicate negotiations with Hitler over the Sudetenland crisis. Charles's dire predictions merely confirmed the Prime Minister's belief that appeasement was the only possible choice. On September 28th, Charles and Anne dropped by the American embassy in London. Ambassador Kennedy waved them into his office. "There's some good news coming in," he said. An agreement had been concluded between Britain, France, and Germany. The Sudetenland would be ceded to Hitler. In return, the few promised not to invade any other countries. War had been avoided for the time being. Confident his report had played a part in this compromise, Charles was not surprised by the outcome, but was very much relieved. Some, however, were less than confident about the Lindbergh report. Remarked one military expert working with the British diplomatic corps in Paris, "The Führer has found a most convenient ambassador in Colonel Lindbergh, and John Slessor soon to become Marshal of the Royal Air Force, wondered how much of Charles's views were due to German propaganda and carefully staged arrangements to impress him. He warned British officials to take the report's estimates with a pinch of salt. Schlesser was right to be cautious. What Charles didn't know was that the Luftwaffe's superiority in the late 1930s was limited to its ability to support German ground troops. It had not yet developed a long-range bomber fleet with the capacity to launch raids on London or any other target distant from Germany. In fact, in August of 1938, 2 years after Charles's first visit, generals informed Goering that German air attacks on Britain would amount to pinpricks. As late as May 1939, Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Hans Jeschonnek warned the German High Command, "Do not let us deceive ourselves, gentlemen. Each country wants to outstrip the other in air armament. But we are all roughly at the same stage." Completely duped by the Nazis, Charles had passed on false intelligence to leaders and military personnel in the United States, Britain, France, and Czechoslovakia. They, in turn, had factored in his fake report when deciding how to respond to Nazi aggression. Not once had Charles attempted to verify what he'd been told, and he used no other data beyond what the Germans gave him. Certainly, he wasn't the only aviator fooled by the Germans, but Charles Lindbergh's views carried more weight than others. And while most historians do not believe the Lindbergh report was a major factor in the decision by England to appease Hitler, Chamberlain, after all, had never wanted to go to war over Czechoslovakia. It had no doubt bolstered the belief that it was better to give Hitler the Sudetenland than to plunge into a war for which the British were not ready.